Welcome to today's webinar, Making Readers Care About Your Writing, brought to you by NCSL. All lines are in place on listen-only mode to provide favorable sound quality during today's presentation. If you'd like to send a question at any time during the webinar, you may type a question in a box on the right-hand side of your screen. Simply type your message into the box and hit the send button. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Patsy Spall, Secretary of the Senate in Texas and immediate past staff chair of NCSL. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Omar. I'm pleased to welcome all of you to today's webinar, Making Readers Care About Your Writing, which is sponsored by the Legislative Staff Coordinating Committee and supported by an NCSL e-learning grant. I'm really happy to announce that over 400 legislative staff from 46 states and 3 territories are participating, making it one of the largest webinars NCSL has ever held. This one-hour webinar presents the concept of issue-driven writing as a way to connect with legislative audiences. All legislative staff, whether experienced or interns, clerical, legal, or IT, will benefit by learning how to use an opening hook to get readers invested in the topic, to develop information based on the reader's questions about the issue, and to present that information professionally but conversationally in a way that's most efficient and most compelling for readers. Our presenter today is Harvey Lillywhite, co-director of Quality Communications Group Incorporated. He is a subject matter expert in workplace writing with a special area of expertise in audit report writing. Harvey has more than 30 years experience in the classroom and the workplace teaching effective writing skills. In addition to teaching writing at Columbia University, the University of Utah, and Towson University, he has taught for government agencies at the federal, state, and local levels and in the private sector. Since 1987, he's been on the training faculty at the Government Accountability Office, where he has taught and helped to develop that agency's extensive writing curriculum. Along with Kevin Dungy, he has authored 2 books on workplace writing, Mastering Workplace Writing Skills and Smart Writing at Work. Harvey is currently finishing a book, Writing Effective Audit Reports, which should be published this year. In addition to all that, he's just finished 2 days of intensive professional development training on writing skills for NCSL staff in Denver. And with that, Harvey, we're anxious to hear what you have to share with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Patsy. I'm very happy to be here. I welcome you all to the webinar. And it's flattering to know that a subject like writing could garner so much attention. So I'm very happy about that. I will be talking to you about writing, and I'll be talking more specifically about writing that makes your readers care about what you write. I'll be talking about 5 concepts as we go through, and then I'll apply them to the 2 memos that you've been sent. One of them I know has a funny title. I call it the Smart Pigs Memo, and the other one is a shorter memo that I call the Chesapeake Room Memo. But I'll be talking about how you can make your readers care, as Patsy alluded to, by using an issue to drive your content, then by addressing your readers' questions about that issue that's important to them, and by developing the significance of your analysis. And the word significance will be significant as we go through and talk about how to make people care. And finally, we'll talk about featuring your main message up front, which is so important. One of the big challenges I feel today is what can I possibly tell you about writing in an hour that you haven't learned in 30 or 40 or 50 years already? Well, I hope I do have some new ways of looking at writing and some ways that will help you think about the writing that you not only write, but the writing that you might review. I'm just switching to the next slide here. Okay, I actually want this. Excuse me for just a minute. That's okay.
Are you going to take
yeah,
it back?
that's fine.
Let me take it back.
No, it's okay.
We'll do your poll.
At the start here, I want to acknowledge that writing is always challenging for all of us. Certainly, individually, it's tough to find the words, to put them into the right order, to convey the thoughts that we have to convey. And then often that's complicated in an organization by having to subject our own personal writing to a review process that can make the writing even more difficult. So I'd like to start at the beginning by launching a poll, and I'd like to talk to you about your own writing concerns. Even though we don't have the ability here to talk to, obviously, everybody, I've listed some writing concerns that are generally common, and I'm just interested to have you vote for which of the following writing concerns reflects your own biggest writing concerns. And you'll see there that number one, it could possibly be translating technical language into common language that your readers can understand. Number two is the problem of achieving conciseness. Number three is avoiding the passive voice. Number four is ensuring that you have a strong message to deliver to your reader. And number five is the problem of getting started. So as the votes are coming in, it looks like ensuring a strong message is number one at the moment, followed closely by achieving conciseness. It's a close horse race. And I'm happy to hear you say that ensuring a strong message is a problem that you realize that you have whenever you try to write. Because what I'm going to be talking about today, and we're not going to be obviously diagramming sentences, we're not going to be talking about grammar, we're not going to be talking about where the commas go. And most of us think of writing as a series of words and sentences and paragraphs that we sort of have to get in order. But it turns out that a huge part of writing has to do with the kind of critical thinking that we can pull together in order to have good content. So look at the slide, and you'll see that I talk about 7 aspects of a text that affect usefulness and readability. What I'm showing you here is that rather than think about writing just as words and sentences and paragraphs, it's extremely helpful to imagine a document as having 7 different layers. And the analogy I might use is that if you pass light through a prism, you would get the rainbow. You'd get Roy G. Biv, I think it is, right? You'd get red and orange and yellow and green and blue and indigo and violet. Well, if you're able to pass a document through a prism, I imagine that you might come up with something like this. At one end of the spectrum, you have content, followed by structure, what we call document design, often called format or layout. And then below that, you have a level of paragraphs, followed by sentences, word choices, and mechanics. And I want you to think of all 7 of these things as happening simultaneously on the page for a reader, and it's your job as a writer to manage what happens at all of these levels, because as it turns out, a mistake at any of these levels is going to compromise the overall writing that you do. Notice also that I've divided these 7 into higher order concerns, which are content, structure, and document design, and lower order concerns, which are what I would roughly call style, which has to do with paragraphs, sentences, word choices, and mechanics. Another way to think about the difference between the higher order concerns and the lower order concerns is that the highest order concern content is really about message soundness. You have to have a good sound message before you worry about how you're going to present that message. So the reason why I arrange these into a hierarchy like this is not so much to say that as writers we shouldn't worry about mechanics, the spelling and the punctuation, or our word choices, which obviously are extremely important for accuracy and for tone. But I arrange them in this order because if we attend to content first, then we can make sure we have a document that's worth worrying about in terms of its structure, how we put it on the page or on the screen, how we write it according to our style. So you might say that if you don't have good content, none of the others really matter. You might also realize that if you have to make any changes at the level of content, any changes you make at that level will have a ripple effect all the way down the line, so that if I change content, probably I'm changing my structure, I'm changing my paragraphs, my sentences, my word choice, et cetera, et cetera. Before we move on and talk in a little bit more detail about content structure, I would like to take one more poll. And I'd like to ask you, when you find comments on your documents that are made by others, or perhaps if you're a reviewer, when you make comments, at which of these 7 levels do you usually find the comments? And in fact, I'm giving you 5 levels here. Do you find that the comments are usually at the level of the content, at the level of how you've organized or structured that content? Are they at the level of how you have formatted or designed the document? Are they having to do with your style, things like punctuation and passive voice and word choice? Or well, I guess punctuation is our 5th one all by itself. So I'm going to take just a second and look at your votes as they come in. And I'm seeing that style is number 2 right now to organization. And that's interesting. Content is also 28% of you voted for content. Not so many people voted for format and punctuation. Well, let me give you my observation. When I look at documents that are reviewed, and I've looked at many of them, I find most of the comments that reviewers make are at the level of what I would call the lower order concerns. I find some comments at the level of content and organization, and by and large, I think they are the most important comments that a writer can get. And personally, when somebody comments on my own writing and they can tell me what I need to add, what's not there, that's usually a content issue. For instance, oh, you didn't talk about X, Y, or Z, you should talk about that. You know, those sorts of comments are very, very useful. But today, we are going to be talking about the first 2 levels. We're going to be talking about content and structure. As Patsy said, I believe, we spent the last 2 days giving full-day courses. And we, in our full-day courses, give you techniques to manage what happens at all of these levels. But as I said, today we're going to be talking about content and structure. And then we'll apply these concepts to the 2 documents that you were sent. So let's start out with content. And I'm going to give you the first overall concept. We should want our writing to be issue-driven. The content should be obviously closely linked to an issue that we have. And let me just take a second to define what I mean by an issue. An issue isn't necessarily bad. It could also be an opportunity. My background is essentially in audit report writing, although I've worked with many different people in all different kinds of writing. But you might think of an issue as an area of risk, or you might think of issue as more generally an area of concern for one reason or another, or to use even a more generic word, it's an area that people are interested in for one reason or another. And the reason I use the word issue instead of topic is because topics are things that when we did academic writing, we were asked by our teachers to develop, sort of didn't matter who was interested in them. But when we do workplace writing, and certainly writing that has to do with legislative issues, we really need to make sure that we're not just writing about topics, but we're writing clearly about issues. And those issues can be statutory, they can come from mandates. Sometimes we're asked to write about things based on requests from legislatures. There could be hotline accusations that we need to address, or often it's current events that come up that we see. Bridges falling down in Minnesota a few years back, certainly that was an issue. We wondered if bridges of a certain age all across the country were going to need repair and so on. But it's very important, if I were to look at your writing, the first thing I'd ask you is, what's the issue here? What's the area of concern for the particular reader? And when we talk about content, we're going to be talking about how content is not merely the answers or the data that you have to transmit to a particular reader, but we say that content really has 3 moving parts. First, and actually most important, are the questions that your reader is going to have about a given issue. I know a lot of people tell me that getting started or writer's block is a problem that they have when they write. And I find that if you can think about what you need to write in terms of an issue that you're writing about, and then the questions that your particular writer would have about that issue, you can begin to generate information. It can help you to get started and overcome the writing block. Content is also about the answers to those questions, quite obviously. And when I talk about answers, I'm being quite literal. I mean, once you ask a question, you should answer it as specifically and directly as you can. And then after you answer the question, you'll have all kinds of supporting information and evidence that you have to look at and provide for your readers as you go along. So far we've learned that when we think about writing there has to be an issue. The content has to be related to that issue. And the way the content is related is that you have a number of questions that your reader wants to have answered, should be answered for the reader. And then we have the answers to those questions, which do come from the research that you do. And then after the answers, you'll have what essentially are other smaller questions, supporting information and evidence that you provide. And you'll see on this slide underneath content that what I'm asking you to do, and this is the second concept that I want us to absorb here today, is that writing is communication at heart. And when we talk about communication, we should realize that as human beings, probably the best model for us for communication is a conversation. And if you look at the word conversation, I don't know if you know this, but essentially it means going back and forth. The con part means with, and the VERS, the verse, means turning. So when you read the word conversation, we're talking about taking turns, going back and forth, exchanging information. And really what is at the heart of any conversation is a series, I would call it a loose series, of questions and answers. And you can appreciate how this works when you'd walk into work on a Monday morning and you would ask a coworker, how was your weekend? And your question would create something that's pretty amazing, an answer, right? People tell you how their weekend was, or we went whitewater rafting, or whatever you happen to do. And if they're interested, they will then ask you, oh, where did you go? I like whitewater rafting. I've always wanted to do that. And a conversation ensues. But it's important right now to appreciate how powerful that exchange of questions and answers is as you communicate with another person. And unfortunately, that's the very thing when I look at writing that's not so successful that I think is lost. People tend to want to just transmit information out into the world without ever pausing to think about their readers and the questions the readers would ask them about this particular issue or topic if they were face-to-face. And I think it's an important concept for us to think about all the writing we do as simulating a conversation on the page for the reader. So how is it possible to simulate a conversation with the reader when the reader isn't even there? Well, possibly you know the person who's going to read your email or your article or the report that you've been asked to write, and maybe you've had a chance to speak with that person and get some sense of what they're expecting. But no matter who your reader is, it turns out that they will always have three, what I would call sort of macro or big questions that help them to cycle through anything they read. On this slide under content, you see those questions. It turns out when we read, we don't read passively, just waiting for the information to flow into us. We read quite aggressively. We read by asking questions and making assumptions, and essentially we're foraging for information. It turns out that readers have a very big superpower that we have to deal with, and that superpower is called the delete button. And whenever we write something that they're not interested in, whether it be an email, a report, or an article, at the moment we don't interest them anymore, they can hit the delete button and we disappear. So we have to be aware of that and be aware that readers are reading, as I said, by asking questions. So the first question you and everybody else who reads asks about anything you're asked to read is, what is this and why should I care? You look at an email. What is this? Why should I care? You take mail out of your mailbox at home. What is this? Why should I care? You sort it very quickly. Junk mail, bill, catalog, letter from Aunt Sally, whatever it is. But you're looking at the information with this question in mind, what is this and why should I care? So it's very important, and the next slide will show this, but it's very important that as writers, we understand that when we want to converse, to communicate with our readers, they are going to be coming to our writing with that question foremost in their mind. So we better have a good way to begin our writing by explaining what the heck this is and why they should care. If you get a reader past that threshold, and we'll talk about how you might do that in a minute, then the next question the reader will have will say, okay, I understand what you're talking about. What's the story, right? They want useful information, and in fact, you might start thinking of your readers as users instead of readers of information. But once you've got them hooked, they know what it is, and they have gone forward because they do care, then they want to know the story, and the story, as you'll see, is essentially the answers to the big questions that relate back to the issue that initiated the piece of writing in the first place. And we'll talk more about those things in a minute. Then if they go through and they're still reading and they've gone through the story, then at the very end, I'll be careful not to call it a conclusion. In the end of your document, the reader will ask, okay, given all that information, what, if anything, is next? Is there a recommendation I need to follow? Is there any activity that I need to do as a reader? Is there anything more that you're going to do as a writer as we move along? So let's look at the next slide, and you'll see that you can use these three big reader questions to begin to structure the overall document that you're trying to write. In the introduction, we address the question for the reader, what is this and why they should care? In the body, we talk about what the story is, the answers to the questions, and in the closing of our document, we tell them what, if anything, is next. And I want to go into a little more detail on this in the next slide and show you that in your introduction, I'm telling you, I think it's a good idea if you think of an introduction not as a chance to drop background information on your reader, to give them a historical account of what you're talking about. In fact, I often joke with the people who I teach writing to. I say, if you're writing for people, especially if you're writing for me and you need to put background into a document that's of any length, I really appreciate it if you put a heading at the top that says background. So very clearly I know that's background, and that way I can skip it. Because I know very few people who go to a document and are just crazy to get to that background section. It's there if they need it, but probably they'll want to look at the big information and the big points that you want to make before they want to go back and read the background. It's there, as I said, if they need it. So look at the introduction in the slide here, and you'll see that in that introduction we have two pieces. First of all, you introduce the issue to your reader, why you're writing, and why the reader should care. This presents the issue in a way that gets them interested, that hooks up to whatever concern or interest they have. And if the issue is presented up front, you're also giving your reader a fair opportunity to opt out of reading. If you show them what the issue is up front and they're truly not interested, then they can move on if they're not interested. But without that initial issue up front that tells me, why are you writing to me and why should I care? Why are you bothering me? I'm busy, right? That needs to come up front, and the shorter that piece is, the better. After you've done that, it's a good idea to preview the topics if there are more than two or more in the document you're dealing with, just to show them the big questions or the big topics that you'll be dealing with. So just to give you a quick example, I was looking at a document that had to do with blocked culverts in the states of Washington and Oregon. And because the culverts were blocked, the wild salmon couldn't get back to their spawning grounds to spawn, and therefore the wild salmon population over the last several years has been diminishing. Well, the big issue for legislators and people in the state of Washington and Oregon was that because the wild salmon population was dwindling, there were a lot of lost jobs and a lot of lost money into the state economy. And so it would probably be a good idea, if I were writing about that, to let people know that there is an issue here of blocked culverts. The wild salmon can't get through. Why is that important? Because it's reduced the number of jobs in Washington, and that's very important in an industry by 40%. It's lost X number of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars into the state economy. And if you're somebody who is interested in that problem, then you'll probably pay attention to what I have to say. And in this case, I would then go on to preview my topics. And in this report, they were looking at 3 particular questions. They were wondering how many blocked culverts there are out there to fix. They were wondering if the 2 entities that are supposed to fix these culverts have been fixing them, and if they have a plan to fix them. And then at the end, they wanted to know what the results of their efforts were to date. So in that brief intro, I've hooked you, if you're interested in that, and I've set you up with 3 big questions that the rest of the document is going to look at. Then I move into the body, and I talk about what the story is, and the story is certainly answers to those particular questions. After I've given you an answer, I need to support what I've said by details. And at this moment, I would like to stop and poll you one more time, because I would like to talk just for a couple of minutes about an aspect of support and evidence that comes into audit report writing, which I think is also useful for anybody who does analytical kinds of reporting. And the question that I want to ask you is, are you familiar with the concept of the 4 elements of a finding? It actually goes back to the GAO Yellow Book, but I'm interested to know if you've ever heard of them, if you've ever used them. And I'm looking, and it looks like overwhelmingly, 70, well, not overwhelming, well over half of you, 2/3 of you, have heard of these elements. Let me just go through them, even for those of you who haven't heard them, and talk about a good way to develop an analytical story when you're answering a question. The 4 elements of a finding begin with what we call criteria. And criteria is the answer itself to a question, which is, how should things be? How must they be according to the law, or how should they be according to best practices or industry standards? And by knowing criteria, when we go in to do an analysis, we know how things ought to be. After that, we need to do our research and find out condition. And condition is the answer to the question, how are things actually at the moment as we look at them? And our job when we do analysis is to compare the condition, the way things are, to the criteria, the way things should be. If you find a gap when you're doing your analysis, then probably you found something that's interesting to people that they would be like to know more about. And then the last 2 elements, just quickly, people might like to know the cause of that gap. Why is it happening? And if you write reports that have recommendations in them, then essentially you are finding the cause of a problem and giving recommendations directly to that cause. And then the final of the 4 elements, which is actually very important, is the element of effect. And effect answers the question, where's the hurt in all this? Where's the significance? Where's the impact? And you might think of effect as one of your most important persuasive tools. If you tell me that I have a problem but I don't see any effect, probably I'm not going to be very worried about that particular problem. And the way you hook your reader at the beginning, the issue, is essentially by telling them, what is the effect of the thing that you're writing about? How does it affect them? How does it affect constituents? How does it affect legislative processes that might be involved? And in a lot of writing I look at, people say there's a problem and expect readers to be concerned when in fact they never go on to develop the idea that there is effect here, there is significance. So very interesting for writers as they're developing the answers to their questions to talk about support, thinking about criteria, condition, cause, and effect. Finally, at the end, we have our closing, and that's, as I've said, what should happen next. Let me just tell you that I don't use the word conclusion there because conclusion is an invitation, I think, to bury your lead, to bury the main message at the end. Academic writing usually puts conclusions at the end, and those conclusions often are where the main information is. And you'll see when we move to the next section that the last thing I'm going to talk about is the importance of putting your main point up front. So, we've talked about the importance of having an issue. We've talked about the importance of making sure your content relates to that issue, how content is really created by having questions that relate to the issue, answers to those questions, and then any supporting information or evidence. And using those techniques, we can now turn to the first memo that you were sent, which is the Office of Pipeline Safety Inspectors Inspection Technology Training. I affectionately call this the Smart Pig memo. If you had a chance to read it, I would like right now to poll and see how you felt about this particular document. And notice that you have 4 choices here. Did you think that this one-page memo was clearly written and had a strong message? Did you think it was clearly written but it had a weak message? Was it unclear in its writing but still there was a strong message? Or did you think it failed on both counts? Was it unclear writing and a weak message? All right, I'm looking at the votes, and number 2 and 4, clear writing but weak message, and unclear writing and weak message are the 2 that people are voting for overwhelmingly. I would tell you that if I were voting, I would vote for number 2. I would call this clear writing just in the sense that I don't think there are a lot of grammatical errors. I think when I read a particular sentence, I can understand what that sentence is telling me. There might be some very minor problems in consistency, the way numbers are either written out or used as numerals, but certainly I think the English teacher in me would go through and wouldn't find too many mistakes. On the other hand, I think it's one of the worst pieces of writing I've ever laid my eyes on. And the reason I think it is so bad is because I don't know what the issue is. I don't understand what questions I should have about this issue. I don't know why they're writing, and the whole thing seems to be buried at the end. So let me just go through it for you, and I'll show you a revision in a minute. But if I were to analyze this, the very first thing I would do is look for the issue. And when you go to the subject line, it says Office of Pipeline Safety, or OPS, Inspectors, Inspection Technology Training. And I have no idea what about that inspection technology training. Is this just a memo telling me what they have? Is it a memo telling me that there is a gap somewhere and they need to fill that gap? Well, as I read through and they thank the reader for the opportunity to do this analysis, I have to say that I don't see very much analysis as I go through. It's nice that they've used a couple of headings, OPS inspections and inspection types, and a little later they talk about OPS inspections training. But as I begin to read, they tell me mere facts. They tell me that OPS has 47 safety inspectors. They tell me that the inspectors have done 768 different inspections. They tell me that the inspections last, or that every pipe gets inspected every 2 to 5 years. They tell me in the second paragraph that there are 6 types of inspections. Now I'm halfway through this memo, and I still don't know the issue. Why are you bothering me? You have all this information, but what do you have to tell me? Well, let me cut to the chase. Buried in the 4th paragraph, you will read, according to OPS officials, the agency plans to issue a new rule. And the new rule is going to require, if you read through that last paragraph, these OPS inspectors to have the technical expertise to understand and make decisions based on smart pig information. Okay, I'm starting to see an issue here. I wonder why there's a new rule. I found out, by the way, that in the year 2010, not counting the BP disaster, there were 6,500 spills, leaks, fires, and explosions nationwide, not counting the BP disaster. That's 18 per day. I found out that on average, there are 34 million gallons of oil and toxic chemicals spilled per year in the United States. And this goes back in large part to undetected pipeline problems that then rupture and let these toxins out. So it is the job of the OPS inspectors to be inspecting these pipelines to make sure that they're okay and these things don't happen. But the problem was, up until this time, they were not required to know anything about or to use these devices that are called smart pigs. And I know that's a funny word. It stands for Pipeline Integrity Gizmo or Gauge. But they're essentially MRI machines, big MRI machines that are run through pipes. And as they spin, they're doing telemetry. And whenever they find an anomaly, they ping out a coordinate so that somebody can go to that particular point and understand that inside the pipe, something bad is happening, which they can then look at before it turns into a rupture. So I think I'm now starting to understand the issue. It wasn't even in the document, a lot of it. But because smart pigs had not been used on a regular basis, there is a new rule that's come along. And this new rule is going to require the inspectors to be certified in smart pig technology. They don't have to use the smart pigs, but now the vendors and operators of pipelines are going to be required to use these smart pigs on a regular basis, send the information to the inspectors, who are then going to be required to be able to look at and understand that data. Well, if you were to dig into the third paragraph, you'd find out that currently there are no courses to teach inspectors about this smart pig technology. So I think we're now starting to see that we have an issue, undetected pipeline ruptures, 34 million gallons of oil and other things leaking out a year because of these undetected pipeline ruptures. In order to deal with that, a new rule is coming along that's going to require the use of smart pigs. Therefore, the inspectors need to be certified. So I think there's one question on the table. Are the inspectors now able to deal with this information? Or if not, can they get certified in time to be certified for the deadline when the rule takes effect? Well, another thing you don't know here that I looked up, I found out that there are 5-day classes that can accommodate up to 50 participants, and it costs $15,000 to do this training. So essentially, I can now tell my reader, OPS inspectors are not currently trained in smart pig technology. However, there's a 5-day class that all 47 inspectors can take. It'll cost $15,000, and they can become certified. And I think I've given the reader a lot of good information. So let's look at a possible revision. And you'll see that in our revised version, we start out with a subject line that is essentially a recommendation, but it's our bottom line message. OPS investigators need smart pig technology training by March 30th. I'll ask all of you to take the subject line, email subject line challenge. From this day forward, when you write an email, see if you can put your main message into the subject line. Maybe you have an important question to ask somebody. Maybe they've asked you a question and you can frame the answer, at least let them know you're answering that, or there's a directive, you need people to do something. See if you can capture that almost like a newspaper headline in your subject line. It's too bad the subject line isn't titled message line, and we thought of it like a newspaper. But here in this revised memo, they give the bottom line recommendation, and they go through and they give us a little bit of the issue because oil pipeline ruptures are not always prevented by current pipeline inspections performed by these 47 OPS inspectors. A new rule has been proposed that will require pipeline vendors to use this smart pig technology. They then say a little bit about what it is regularly within all pipelines. Then they give you the finding. Our investigation determined that current technology training does not include any courses that deal with this smart pig technology, and then they give you a way to deal with that. We find that many vendors can provide this training, 5-day training, $100 or $15,000, and it says also that training must be scheduled 3 months in advance, and then they end finally with their action that needs to follow. We recommend that OPS schedule smart pig training for all its inspectors by March 30th. Now, what I want you to appreciate here is that we revised this without dealing with grammar. We didn't look at any sentences to change them. We just went back and we said, okay, I have to put my issue up front. We understood it, we wrote it. From that, we thought about questions. Well, there's a new rule that's going to require certification. Are these inspectors certified? That's the big question on the table. We answered it. We said they're not certified. Then we went the next step, because once the reader finds out they're not certified, it's quite obvious that you'd want to know, can they get certified? How can they get certified, right? So as a writer, it's up to you to really be thinking about the questions that your reader is going to have as they cycle through the issue and the big questions that you have. And you see there are 3 parts. There's an introduction, the story is in the middle, 2 paragraphs, and the ending is essentially the action that's going to come next. And again, what I want you to appreciate is that we did that revision without getting into the lower order concerns. We just did a content scrub, essentially, right? All right, the last thing that I want to talk about just in the last 5 minutes before we cut to questions is it's very important when you organize your information to put the main point up front. And you'll see we have the big red T, and across the top we think the main message, right? And then under that we have the support for that main message. And if I could, I'm going to show you one other slide about this idea of main point up front. Excuse the small handwriting, I hope you can see this, but another word for putting the main point up front is deductive organization or deductive structure. And what you see is deductive structure happening not just at the overall level of a document, but you see that this document evidently has 2 major sections, and they are deductive. And if each of these 2 major sections had subsections, they would be deductive, so you'd have even a 3rd level of T's. And then if you looked inside each of those subsections, you'd see the actual paragraphs. And we would say that the paragraphs are also little T's. So what I'm telling you here is that when you organize a document, you should organize it deductively from the very beginning, the biggest part, the whole document, all the way down to the level of a paragraph. So how do you do that? Well, if you have a lengthy document, you can start out with an executive summary. You could start out with a title, perhaps, that gave the main message. But an executive summary that in 1 page tells the reader, what is this, why they should care, what the story is, in other words, what are the answers to the big questions that you've set up, and then finally, what's next if there's any action. On a single page, that would be a beautiful executive summary. Then you preview, tell people you have 2 big questions, or here you see the word objective, and we're going to talk about 2 big things. The first T talks about the first thing, the second T talks about the second thing. What would make those sections deductive? Well, you could have a big heading that was a complete sentence that gave the major message for that section. And if you had several subsections, you could even have a short little paragraph under that heading that said, this section will talk about these 3 things to orient them to that section. When you get into a subsection, you could have a subheading, again, a complete sentence that tells the reader what the main point is. And when you get into paragraphs, you could talk about the topic sentence at the very beginning. So try to organize your information so that it's deductive at every level. I'm going to quickly take a poll on the Chesapeake Room memo, short little memo. And again, I'm going to ask you about this Chesapeake memo. Did you think it was good writing or not such good writing? Clear writing, strong message, clear writing, weak message. unclear writing, strong message, unclear writing, weak message, again, as we did last time. And this is for the Chesapeake memo. Okay, those of you who are picking number 4, unclear writing and weak message, I think I agree with you wholeheartedly. And again, just in a quick minute, let me organize this deductively for you by putting the main message first. I am going to say, first of all, the 2 line says all potential users. And by the way, this Chesapeake room is at my university, Towson University in Baltimore. So you are a potential user. So I'm not sure if you got this email or not, but you could have. It should have gone just to the people who have events scheduled for this particular week, I'm sure. And the subject line should have said probably something like, Chesapeake room is closed for repairs. I've relocated your event. I think that might get your attention if you were one of these people. Then I would think about what my reader's response would be. I give them the issue. The Chesapeake room must be closed for repairs next week. I've relocated your event to the Susquehanna room next door. So I can imagine now my reader is going to want to know, how will my guests know to get there? Is it going to be the same? How is this going to inconvenience me? So you let them know the answers to those questions. This room is configured identically to the other room, has a beautiful view of the Riverwalk area. The next paragraph, you don't need to alter your event in any way, main point up front. We will set up the room as you've directed. We'll provide seating for all your guests. Our staff will be at the room to make sure that all your guests are moved where they need to be. And then finally at the end, future action. I think I've answered all my readers' questions, but I'm going to give my particular name and my particular contact number in case they need to contact me. And the last point I'll make before we open this webinar up to any questions that you might have is that by putting your main point first, you will help to make your entire documents concise. Whenever you do what I call inflicting deductive organization or deductive structure on a piece of writing and make myself put the main point first at the biggest level, at each major section and subsections, and even at the level of the paragraph, I find that it becomes very clear to me what information might be moved, moved to a background section, moved to an appendix, or gotten rid of altogether. And I can concentrate much more clearly when I put my big point up front in how I need to develop that idea. So this has been a quick seminar, but I think that if you use these techniques for developing content that's issue-based, that deals with the questions your readers will have, answers those questions, and supports those answers with whatever information that you need by way of evidence or details, and you arrange your information with the main point first, you'll find that you can really improve your writing a whole lot, even without worrying about the style. Not that you shouldn't worry about style. That's a webinar for, I think, for another day. So right now, I think we're going to open it up to questions. Kevin, have you been?
Yes, I have 2 questions that are related. The first and second, it says, when dealing with technical information, where or how should you put background information? And a follow-up question is, could you make some recommendations about how you move away from starting with backgrounds to what we've called introductions?
Yeah. Good questions. Let me talk first about technical information. Obviously, it depends on how much technical information and what kind of readers you have. If you have a technical audience who can read the technical information, then you don't need to shy away from it. But usually you have a variety of readers, and some of the important decision makers are people who won't understand the technical information. So a couple of things you can do. If you're forced to use a technical term, and I read a report recently that used the term arrow triangulation, have no idea what that meant, but it was important for what they were trying to tell me, you can stop right there and define it for the reader so that they understand what it is. I'm never in favor of dumbing down a document. I think you should write in plain English, but I think that you need to write in such a way that you make available to the people you're talking to the technical expertise that you have, but in a way that they'll understand. Much the way doctors talk to us. I mean, they do lots of technical diagnoses, but they're able to talk to us to make available the information in a way that we can understand. But Another possibility you have is to put very technical information into a technical appendix, put it to the back, and those people who want to go there can go there. But we don't want to impede the people who are reading along and just want to get the bigger picture. The second question had to do, Kevin, say one more time.
Second question was, how can you help us move away from sort of the habit of backgrounds into writing these introductions you talked about?
The habit of starting out with background, I think I trace to my academic days when teachers told me I had to write a 20-page paper, and the only way I was getting to page 20 is if I put 10 pages of background. I never had more than about a page and a half of serious things to say about anything. But, you know, I don't think in a rough draft you worry about it, you get it out there. But understand that when I talk about the issue, I am in a way talking about background. In fact, I would define issue as the smallest swath of background information that helps the reader get engaged and connect and understand why what I'm talking about is important. So inherent in my picture of the introduction, if you're going to start with the issue, is inevitably going to be some background information. Call it context, setting the context, right? Setting the issue. So I think you are going to have to talk a little bit in terms of background up front, but I would limit that as much as I could because readers don't need any more of the background than enough to get them interested. Then you can have a background section if you have a longer document. As I said at the beginning, label it background, and that gives your readers a chance to opt in, or to opt out if they want. But be very skeptical of background information. Readers often need much less background than we writers think they need. They want to understand the issue. They want to have their questions answered primarily. If something is an extremely difficult problem and there's a lot of back and forth, then I think that can then become a major section. And you can say people have misunderstood this issue, or there are two sides to this issue which must be discussed, and you can talk about them. But in that case, it's really turning not so much into background, but into an essential part of what you want to talk about. Okay, another question.
This is an interesting question. How do you implement the deductive style without being repetitive? And if you'll allow me, Harvey, to say, we can probably tell people that nobody reads much.
As Kevin says, few people are taking our documents to the beach for a little light reading, and so I think as writers and reviewers, we're struck more by the repetition than our readers are. The kind of repetition you find in deductive documents is really to acknowledge the fact that you have readers reading at different levels. Kevin, you might talk about the general and the executive summaries for the general, you know?
Yes, somebody once in doing some training at the Department of Defense said, the way I've been taught, he said, to think about a report is that the first page is for the general, the rest of the report's for the colonels, and the technical appendices are for the master sergeants who actually implement.
Yeah, and setting up a one-page executive summary, that should be a standalone document. And of course, when you go into the bigger document, you're going to be talking about the same thing. It'll be sort of an exploded view. If you're talking in particular about what we call as auditors charge paragraphs or finding paragraphs, they often repeat the main point of a whole section. But again, keep in mind that we want to create many different entry points to our document. And every time a reader comes into a document, whether it be at an overall level, a major section, a subsection, we want them always to be met with the main idea and then the discussion. And let me just say something very quickly. When we communicate with each other, we use deductive structure naturally. If I ask you a question, where's a good restaurant to eat? You don't say, restaurants, there's an interesting subject. Let me give you the whole history of restaurants, right? You say, well, my favorite restaurant is Ray's number 3, which is just down the road about 2 blocks, right? We are in the habit, when we hear questions, of answering them. So let's retrain ourselves when we write to get back into that habit. We're not writing for teachers anymore.
There's a question that says the rule in the revised Smart Pig memo is important in its own right and does create an imperative, but wouldn't a discussion of the scope of the problem have made policymakers more willing to part with the money? And I think I can answer that by saying, up front, it's obvious that there's a big sort of ecological problem, and that may be enough of the scope, but maybe you'd like to say more, Harvey.
No, I think that the memo that I showed was making it small enough to fit onto a PowerPoint slide. You know, I certainly would have talked to them in that first paragraph about how many oil spills there are per day and how much per year is being spilled because of these undetected ruptures. But again, I think I could name that tune in a paragraph. I don't think I need to go on and on. And if I did feel compelled to talk more about that, that's where you need a background section. So perfect place to put an extended discussion.
Someone asked, are there any handouts or brochures we can refer to when we write letters and correspondence? I imagine you'll say that these principles apply to those, and we should always think about what's our point. Why are we writing?
I do. I think that the things that I've talked about today apply to the most humble email that you're sending out. Don't waste people's time. Get to the point. We're foraging for information. They also apply to the longest reports that I've seen that I work with, for instance, at GAO or other places. Was the question specifically about where do you find templates?
I can't tell from the question, but it sounds like they're handouts or brochures or advice, you know, places they would go.
Yeah. Email me and I'll send them to you.
Someone asked, what recommendations do you have for use of visuals, charts, graphs? If you don't mind, Harvey, I'll answer this one. My recommendation for graphs and charts is you realize there are two types. There are types that we might call them charts that give simply information, you know, pie charts, things like that. And then there are a series that actually have messages. So try to figure out which one you're working with. Second, adopt the right one. Make sure you use the correct standards and measurement and so forth. And third, people would rather look at a picture than read 2 or 3 pages of text. So use them as often as you possibly can.
Yep. We put up our contact information. As I said, Kevin and I have techniques for all 7 of the levels, the hawks and locks, as we go through, that are quite specific and help people to manage all of those areas.
One more question, which is how many reviewers do you suggest for a report? Which sounds like how many people does it take to unscrew a light bulb? But go ahead.
I was just at GAO last week, and the person who is helping me teach the course said that on average a GAO report goes through 7 levels of review. I think if you can do concurrent review, that is, I'll send a draft and have all the internal stakeholders weigh in, give me the information back and let me go through that, then that's a lot better than ping-ponging a draft from me to the first person. I make the changes, I ping it to the next person, I make the changes, I ping it to the next. That's a very inefficient model. We talk about the importance of having review not just at the end, but throughout the writing process. So as a writer, before I ever write, I should show a very detailed outline to all of the internal stakeholders and supervisors before I write. And, you know, that's called creating a blueprint. You don't just go build a house and ask if the client likes it. You create a blueprint, and then once you have the blueprint, you have a pretty good chance that the person's going to be in the neighborhood of where you're thinking of. So review also throughout the process.
Someone asks, can you provide specific examples of existing good legislative writing that incorporate the various principles that you have discussed it in? I guess we would say some of the states that are producing audit-style reports are pretty good models.
Yeah, I can. Again, if you contact us, I think I can send you back some good models. Okay, those seem to be the biggest questions. So again, one more question came up.
Will the Orioles win the American League East this year?
Yeah, they're going to come close. I hope they make the playoffs. We'll just see, you know. Keeping my fingers crossed here. Good question.
We said
Red Sox, yeah, you never know. Okay, I think we're done. Patsy, if you want to play us out.
I certainly will, Harvey. Thank you so much. And also, Kevin, thank you for joining us today and sharing this helpful information. And I want to thank everyone who participated today and let you know that this webinar will be posted on the NCSL website within a week, so you can go back and review it. And once again, thank you. Have a nice weekend.